Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today I want to talk a little bit about a recent Stephen Moffat interview where he spoke, among other things, about the accusations around Doctor Who being woke, as well as the potential of a Stephen Moffat 2, or perhaps lack thereof, in the near future. But before we get into that, if you could do me a teeny tiny little favour, if you enjoy regular Doctor Who content, hit that subscribe button. We are trying to get to 25,000 subscribers for the new year, and we are getting ever so close to that goal, so any support would be greatly appreciated on that front. But with that said, let's get right into it. So the original article is from the Times, and it says, Stephen Moffat, the Doctor isn't woke, he's a classic liberal. Now I'm not going to read the whole article, A, because it's behind a paywall, and B, we'd be here forever because it's a very long interview. But luckily some people on Twitter have basically accumulated all the relevant quotes that I want to talk about here. But of course, if you want to read the whole article, it's out there for you to read. I want to thank Luke at Barbara Yataxa for providing these screenshots. I've also got a screenshot of something that they didn't include later on. So the first quote is him basically being asked about the Disney deal and whether it's going to be renewed or not. And to that he says, I've got no idea. I don't think anyone has got an idea. There's a lot of fuss being made about this, but can I just gently point out most shows are not commissioned before they go out. Russell obviously had the first two commissioned at the same time, but as you know, it's absolutely normal to wait until the show has gone out to see if it comes back again. There's nothing unusual about that. Even if Disney pull out, and I'm not saying that they will, he still thinks the show will be fine, and can continue under the sole auspices of the BBC. I wonder what he thinks of the people who say it's become too woke and socially conscious, culminating, for instance, in a Davis episode featuring a transgender character and which seemed to make people claim that the universe is non-binary. Does the show have an agenda to make the world a better kind of place, and is that a problem? So before we get into all that, yeah, he doesn't seem worried about the show's future going forward. If I remember correctly, during even the Moffat years, it was kind of up in the air, you know, what was happening with Doctor Who at certain points. I remember the 2016 gap year very well, and the reason they said there was a gap year was there was, quote, a surplus of national moments, which strikes me as an odd reason, like, oh, there's just too much going on in 2016, we couldn't possibly have a Doctor Who series out that year. Like, it didn't strike me and many others as particularly believable. So I trust Moffat somewhat more than, like, some other places because he's had direct experience of having to go through this rigmarole of Doctor Who getting recommissioned and so on and so forth. But carrying on with what he says, I think a lot of fiction works that way. How do people learn how to be good except through fiction? That's what heroic fiction is. You can argue that's what religion is. It's a constructed set of myths, giving you an ideal to work towards. Fairy tales, in effect. Tell us what life is always like and what you should be doing about it. Imagine in a world without stories. How would you know how to be good? A story without a moral dilemma pretty much doesn't happen. There's a moral fable element to Doctor Who, but I can't think of a show where there isn't. I think that's a very good point. You know, a lot of people say that, like, oh, you know, I just want my media without a message behind it. But inherently, every piece of media has some sort of message behind it. Otherwise, there'd be no point in a story being told. I think it just comes down to the skill of the writer being able to organically weave that into a story, which I happen to think Moffat's pretty good at. Accusations that the show has become too woke only tell half a story, he adds, pointing to a 2017 episode called Oxygen that he wrote for Capaldi, in which the Doctor was denouncing capitalism. The same year, a Frank Cottrell Boyce episode called Smile had the Doctor saving the world by quote-unquote using capitalism. He says, you can look them up to see if you agree. If you're to harvest the show for things that you don't agree with, so you can feel pleasurably irate, help yourself. But don't pretend that you've uncovered our secret agenda, because we don't have one. The entire culture is like the Time War. It's a war that absolutely no one notices is going on, and we don't have the budget to show anyway. Literally no one cares about any of this guff. Literally nobody. You know, maybe a few fatuous media lovers like me wandering around in our tiny bubble with all the other pinheads give a shit about this. But check the bus queues and restaurants in Britain. Go and listen to the living rooms. Do you think they're talking about any of this bloody crap? Of course they're not. And most of them wouldn't know what the word woke meant, except as, you know, a distinction between being asleep and not. For goodness sake, stop it. Nobody cares. The Doctor is a classic liberal, in the sense that he thinks he should be in charge and someone should get him tea. Now, there's a lot to uncover there. Obviously, he basically says that a lot of people aren't really thinking about media being too woke outside of, like, media and online circles. And I think that's somewhat true. Most people are focused on getting through life and the cost of living and taxes and healthcare. They're not thinking about, what the colour of a certain character's skin is. They're just not, for the most part. So I think that's very true. On this point about the Doctor being a classic liberal, this is something I've seen quite a bit of discourse around. It's not actually that out of line with stuff Moffat has said previously. I refer back to this a lot, but if you go back to an interview he did in 2017 after he left, he says basically the same thing, that as much as the Doctor is someone who wishes to do right by people and believes he is in the right, he's also someone who expects to be in charge and expects to get a cup of tea and expects to be respected and is not very happy when other people are made to be in charge. And I think that is somewhat true. There is a slight aristocratic tinge to the character that's always existed there right from the beginning. My only point of difference is the way I see liberalism is kind of in more of the preserve of the status quo, whereas I think the Doctor is very much anti the status quo 99% of the time. That would be my main disagreement with this kind of read on the Doctor, but I get that everyone's read on the Doctor is different, and I mean, who am I to really argue with Stephen Moffat? He's the guy who's written like a billion Doctor Who stories at this point. But I think he's completely right that a lot of these buzzwords and a lot of these ideas, people don't really care about in like the real world, At least I don't. What I care about is the Doctor Who episode good? Is it written well? That's mainly what my concern is at this point. And we can agree and disagree about, which ones are and which ones aren't, but that's more of an interesting conversation to me than, but it's woke and, rip Doctor Who 1963 to 2017. Doctor Who and fiction in general has always had a message behind it, as he rightly points out. And at the risk of getting too political, I often think that the culture war, rather than being actually important, is something largely constructed by rich people to keep us distracted from the real problems facing the world. But that's me putting a statement out there, and I won't do it again, because I try and keep politics out of this channel for the most part these days because it's just a headache to deal with. But I wanted to cover this quote regardless because I think it's a very interesting point that Moffat makes. Moffat even said way back in the day that you have to write Doctor Who even for those who voted leave for context, the Brexit referendum that happened a couple of years ago. So he seems to be someone who is like the most conscious about kind of making sure that Doctor Who doesn't alienate people, and that is something I do appreciate. I also think his comments on religion basically being a set of beliefs and a set of values is particularly interesting, and you can kind of tell that religion's been on his mind a lot, which maybe lends credence to an idea I posited in a previous video. But there is one more quote I want to go over. So this is on the future of Doctor Who. At some point, Russell will leave again, and that will not be me taking over. I can assure you of that. But then, quite rightly, I hope a whole new flood of people will come in, and I think that would be slightly weird for me to be bobbing around in my late 60s with a bunch of 20-year-olds making it. So yeah, that's basically Moffat confirming that a Moffat 2 is not on the cards, and I know that some people did want this, and look, I love Moffat's writing as much as the next guy. Matt Smith's one of my favourite Doctors, but ultimately I do think this is for the best, and the reason I do is exactly what he said. I think the show needs fresh blood, especially after Russell. The way I feel about Russell coming back is essentially this. I think he made sense to come back given the place the show was at when he came back. There's no secret that the Whittaker era was facing declining popularity. Bringing him back was a boost in the sense of it got people talking about the show again. The 60th was very successful for the most part. Season 1 less so. But I don't think that Russell T Davies, as much as I love him, is a long-term solution. I think he is a good interim period to basically get the show, on a better track before handing it on to someone else. That's the way I see Russell's role as kind of a caretaker showrunner, is the way I personally see it. I think he's also fantastic at doing the PR publicity talks. If you look at him on the One Show and stuff, I think that's where he shines. And going forwards, even if he wasn't showrunner, I wouldn't mind him being an ambassador for the programme going forwards because I think he's great at being the Doctor Who guy on the television who's interacting with, the media. But I don't think he needs to be the main writer for too much longer going forwards. Obviously, we know it'll likely be him for season 3 and, until Gatwa leaves. But after that point, I do think I'd like to see someone new take over with a completely fresh perspective and really, reinvigorate the show and do some new stuff with it. But that's just my thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on Moffat's statements today? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them down in the comments below. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.